Thank you for tuning in, and as the title states, I'm going to talk a lot about my journey into building a V10 6.8 liter 2003 Mustang. This was one heck of a project and took a pretty decent amount of time and resources to get it done. So I want to go into detail about what happened, what went wrong, how you can do it, and answer any questions that may come up about it. I guess the best way to start out would be explaining why I decided to do this. The main inspiration started out coming from Ford themselves when they produced the Boss 351 back in 2004. I remember seeing the test footage of when they originally drove the car and just being blown away with how amazing a concept it sounded like. A 40-valve V10 Mustang, something I needed in my life. After that came Build It Yourself, when they started reproducing that same exact engine for a Lincoln Continental. An absolutely insane build with fabrication and engineering I could only dream of. I decided to do the next best thing I could with my current budget, shop supplies, as well as just in general, how much I'm willing to do before going mentally insane. So I went with a 2001 Ford F550, taking the 6.8 V10 motor out, completely rebuilding it from the block up, and slapping some cams on top for good measure. Before anything else, though, I had to research the topic to see if it was even possible. Ford has obviously done it already, however the issue being that was a smaller 10-cylinder engine. That was essentially an aluminum block cut in half and welded back together to add an extra 2 cylinders. I couldn't necessarily do that, so I had to now fit a much bigger liter engine underneath my hood against the frame, as well as trying to keep all the odds and ends in place, such as the Hydro Boost brakes, power steering, and maybe the AC system. That I was willing to lose because I did have a daily driver. That's when I came across a small YouTube channel called Eric and Taylor, where they actually built what I wanted to build myself. There it was. About a year after I decided to begin the project and start my research, they posted a video which showed a 6.8 liter 10-cylinder engine in a New Edge Mustang. Exactly the same way I would have done it. One big difference, however, was the wiring. The wiring seemed to be the most difficult part, with combining an 8-cylinder harness with the 10-cylinder engine. That's when I got into brainstorming a little bit on what I can do to help save myself the grief. I decided the best course of action, because obviously the engine could fit, would be to take the entire wiring harness, computers, fuse boxes, everything, out of the truck and transplant everything into the Mustang. I would feed it voltage from the battery, a few switches, a key, and all the fluids it could need. And from there it would run on its own as if it was still inside the truck in the first place. That would prevent me having to do any crazy wiring work, reading diagrams for years on end, just to prepare. I could just take the running engine, transplant it right in. That also allowed me to test everything out once the engine was built, before it even went into the car. After that engine was built up in my garage, I was able to start it up, and it ran on its own. Just a drip feed of fuel from a random pump I bought off Amazon, and some battery. After all that, however, it became an issue in my head about how all that integration would be on the Mustang side. As I began planning out this build, a few issues showed themselves. How will the cooling system work? How will the suspension handle the extra weight? What about braking with that extra weight? That's when I realized I kinda got lucky with the way my car was already being built. Before this project began, I actually had a 4.6 V8 from the prototype engine division. I got it from my college when I was just desperate looking for a new motor, and they just so happened to be throwing an old engine out that was sitting in a crate the whole time. I wish I kept all the parts off that engine, because I know for a fact most of them cannot be found anymore. I still have the short block, but the entire upper cylinder heads intake was all replaced, unfortunately. But with that engine, I did do some modifications to the car. Coilover systems were installed in the suspension on the front and rear, as well as a triple core radiator on the front. Weight reduction was already done on the interior of the car, and there was plenty more options, such as a tubular K-member, as well as bumper support. But then there's the brakes. I actually did a Brembo swap out of a Cadillac. A company called S&S Engineering actually makes a kit that allows you to install these calipers directly to the hub. I got the calipers, installed them on the car. All this before I even realized I was going to do such an intense engine swap. And even then, it wasn't as intense as I thought it would be. The 6.8 liter 10-cylinder engine is part of the modular motor family, which includes obviously the 6.8, the 5.4 V8, and the 4.6 V8. All those engines have, well, modular parts. The same motor mounts can be used, the same transmission bell housing patterns, starters, sensors, even certain attachments for hoses and lines are all interchangeable between each mod motor. I essentially had a bigger bore 4.6 with 2 extra cylinders. I already had a lot of parts, and I was even able to use the same transmission out of the Mustang. That's when I began building my parts list. Really, this included all the internals of the engine for a rebuild, cams from Todd Warren, as well as some odds and ends, like a tubular K-member and A-arm kit for weight reduction, a low-profile oil pan from an E350 van, which just so happens to also carry the 6.8 10-cylinder, but with a smaller pan compared to the F550. That allowed me to clear my power steering rack without having to need any crazy setups or skid plates to prevent the pan from getting hit. The subframe is still the lowest part on the engine area. A set of adjustable height motor mounts just from the 4.6 were also bought, but at the end of the day, there was not much fabrication that needed to be done whatsoever to get this engine to fit. For the most part, everything simply bolted into place, with some percussive encouragement on the frame as well as the exhaust manifolds. I was able to get everything in place, and the engine, after being built, was test fit into the Mustang for the first time, where it didn't really want to fit. That's where I ran into a huge issue: the hydro boost. While in the video with Eric and Taylor, they had their hydro boost still equipped. In order to clear certain things with my new K-member and adjustable height motor mounts, I unfortunately had to get rid of the hydro. It just made test fitting an absolute nightmare, and it nearly impossible to get the valve cover out if I ever had to do maintenance on the driver's side. Even after my solution, it still is going to be very difficult. I had to swap over to a manual brake setup from TBN brakes. This unfortunately made me lose my power brakes, but with some drilling and measuring on the brake arm, I was able to actually position the brakes to feel relatively normal. Definitely need to put a little more force into the pedal, but it's not as much as you'd believe, especially because it was properly set up. With the hydro boost out of the way, the engine was now ready to go into the car permanently. That's when I ran into another issue. This whole time I've been trying to use the stock headers from the 6.8, but they're giant cast iron, bulky as can be, so they were not fitting up to that frame unless something was getting cut. That's when I looked over at my old 4.6, which I just so happened to install some BBK shorties on a while ago, and it got me thinking, if these motors really are modular, can't everything fit together? And sure enough, those headers fit right on, but I was missing 2 cylinders. That's when I had to get a fabricator to do the only part of fabrication in this entire project. I now had a lot of my issues already solved. The engine slipped in clean with just a little bit more percussive encouragement on the headers and frame, but after that, everything went together nice and smooth. The transmission bolted up, and then I tried installing the drive shaft. The drive shaft completely bottomed itself up against the output shaft of the transmission. There was no way it was going to be able to flex, especially once the car was off the lift and on the ground. That was a simple fix. All I had to do was flip my motor mounts backwards, and that solved my problem. It moved the engine forward a little bit, gave my transmission clearance to fit the shifter properly, as well as allowing the drive shaft to move freely. Once the engine was in and fit, now came the annoying part: getting the fuel lines hooked up, as well as all the wiring. And wiring is not my strong point. To get my fuel system set up and transformed from a returnless style system from the 4.6 into a return style system for the 6.8, I had to get a little creative. I ended up taking out all my evap system, from the charcoal canister to the purge valve, all the way down to the lines at the tank itself. And that left a very nice vapor line running all the way from the tank to the front of the car. That was my new return line. I didn't have to do any extra mounting. I simply connected some fuel grade pipe and hooked it up. As for the front of the engine, I now have a return line and a feed line. That's all I had to do. Next was wiring my fuel pump to be always on when the car is running. That was my next big problem. How was I going to wire everything up without cutting too much into the Mustang's harness? I still wanted diagnostic systems to work for both sides of the vehicle, Mustang and truck. And because everything was being wired separately, I had to think of something. So, 2 keys. That was my solution. Nice and simple. I found the ignition switch and hooked that up to the Mustang key. So the starter still goes on the Mustang key, but everything else on the 10-cylinder side is through a new key that I installed. That was as simple as finding the wiring on the 10-cylinder harness that had to do with key on, engine off, and connecting them up to a switch controlling the voltage. More work for me having to do 2 keys when I get into the car, but I don't mind it. Also, it's extra security for me. Other than that, there was not much else that had to be done. All the wires had to get routed. Everything really started taking place inside the passenger side fender up by the front. The battery was already relocated to the trunk, so I didn't have to deal with driver's side at all. So the air filter was able to settle right there. Passenger side has my fuse boxes, interior and exterior, as well as my harness, and all of its connections now run through that fender out to where they need to go. Transmission harnesses did not have to be run because I was going from an automatic engine to a manual transmission. I didn't have to run anything back there except for my reverse lights. Some issues did come up with all of this, however. Mainly my feedback into the vehicle. How am I going to see my speed, RPM, fuel, if the PAT system will no longer allow my car to read anything? So how was I going to get around that security system? One large bonus that I found during my research was getting specifically a 2001 F550 series pickup. I could avoid having emissions as well as the PAT system on the truck side. There was no catalytic system, no downstream O2 sensors, no EGR valve, and again, no security system. So I could take that truck engine and run it without the dashboard, as well as a bunch of other wiring. Looping back around to my feedback, I now had to figure out a way to get this engine to communicate with me and allow me to see what's going on through the dashboard. That's when I found a company called Intellitronics. They made LED dashboards that were made to spice up the look of your car. I had one sitting in a box for a long time. With that dashboard, I now had a reading on my fuel level, engine RPM, speed used by GPS, as well as other little bits and pieces like my battery voltage, oil pressure, and coolant temperature. Now, a little more detail on how the engine was built. First off, it was ripped out of the F550, as well as all the wiring from the truck. The interior was completely torn apart, as well as the engine bay, to get every single harness, sensor, and plug out of there. I would deem whether or not they could be cut later on. After getting the engine out with a few friends, I got it all back home, where first thing I did, I figured out a way to get it to run on its own. Made definitely way easier by the fact there was no PAT system or any other necessary components to let it run, besides just giving it voltage. Originally, I was just going to take this engine as is and throw it in the car, not even really doing much else to it. It only had 150,000 miles on it. The reason why the trunk was in the yard was because the frame was rusted. The project started. The engine was torn down to the block, everything sorted, and then the reassembly began. New rings, bearings, everything checked, everything measured, a hone on the bore, and everything was looking smooth. New timing components, new valves, new springs to handle the cams I was going to put in, and that was it. Everything was together. Unfortunately, however, the brand new OEM timing chain tensioners I ordered turned out to not be so new. And I only found that out later on during my startups. We get everything together and torqued down, and it was ready for its debut. So I set it back up just like in my garage. After making sure, of course, there's no piston to valve contact and everything was timed properly, we set it up for the first start. Immediately on startup, the engine fired up to around 3,000 RPM and just sat there. It refused to idle down and was getting extremely hot. Unfortunately, with the amount of things that were replaced, I couldn't figure out exactly what was causing all these issues. So I let the engine run for less than 30 seconds and then cut the test. All these issues were caused simply by the idle air control valve being flipped upside down. Even though the oil pressure was primed, that defective timing chain tensioner decided to jump 2 teeth on bank 1. I didn't realize though until much later on, because surprisingly, there was no piston to valve contact. No issues presented themselves. If anything, the engine ran strong. just slightly rougher than I'd say normal, but I considered that as being the cams and other engine parts breaking in. Once the issue was figured out to be that timing, I had to take apart the engine again, retime it, put it back together, and then I had a truly solid running engine. Only things of note for building up the engine was about swapping over from the F550 oil system to an E350 oil system for a lower pan, as well as getting the filter housing swapped over from the 4.6 into the 6.8. But again, the modular engine setup makes it very easy to do so. All in all, that was all that was involved with the engine swap. As difficult as it seemed at first, it really was straightforward. Most of my parts just fit together because of the nature of the mod motors, and many stock parts were able to be reused, like the rear end, drive shaft, transmission. It was a relatively straightforward swap. And again, the real fabrication work was just on the exhaust. The frame just had to be bent in. It was more along the lines of just getting everything to fit and getting some supporting mods. I got lucky having installed them all earlier on, but otherwise the list would include bigger brakes to allow you to stop easier with your new manual master cylinder, a bigger cooling system, lightweight parts such as a tubular K-member, A-arms, and bumper support, not only for the weight, but also the ease of maintenance on your new tightly fitting engine, a new dashboard, and some gauges if you'd like to give you some feedback, and other odds and ends, like a battery relocation kit, some switches, some wire, and a lot of zip ties. Using your brain is the best possible way to get all these things to fit together. There's no de facto guide I can give because even Eric and Taylor's V10 Mustang came out very different than my own. I took an easy and cheap route because of the situation I'm in, and it worked out for me. It may work out for you. It's no Boss 351 in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't have the power, the torque, or the sky-high RPM that the 351 had. It's my car. I wanted to do something unique. Instead of boosting the 4.6 or swapping a 5.0, I wanted something fun and interesting, and I got just that. And having that much torque out of what's essentially a tow truck in a 3,500 pound frame, I think that's fun enough for me. It's not something easy, and definitely not good for the power you'd be gaining. It's not the most difficult of engine swaps, but either way, it has its challenges. And like I said before, I got lucky. I had a lot of parts on hand or already installed. The price tag would have been higher, but even then, all things considered, this was still a very cheap engine job compared to some of the other options. More content will be posted soon. Definitely some exhaust videos, and any questions that are asked will be answered. Thank you all so much for watching. Keep building and never stop learning.